Hi, Holly.
Good morning. Looks like
What's that?
Deputy Mayor Tincher and Mr. McCarthy are here. Just waiting for some of your colleagues.
Okay. Good morning, Jamie. Hello, John. We just finished our press conference and tour of the council chambers with the new murals. They're, you just never know with art. And it's just beautiful. It's transformative and beautiful. It makes the chambers kind of have that history meets modern, like Copenhagen. It's really cool. So that's why we can see people kind of wandering around in the chambers in the one shot. They're just getting a peek. See, Ms. Naker and Mr. Tao have joined us. Just 10:01, so we'll give our colleagues just a minute or two, and then we will get started.
I'm just running to get some water, Council President, in case you talk to me.
All right. All right. So I see Mr. Tolbert, Mr. Tao, Ms. Naker, Ms. Yang, Ms. Jalali. So it looks like we have a pretty full house here. And so we will get started. This morning, I will call the org committee meeting to order and begin with a little switcheroo. Well, I guess I would just like to start by saying Ms. Naker and I just finished a press conference in front of Ramsey County Courthouse and City Hall where we revealed the new mural art for the council chambers. And we heard from two of the artists, artist statements for the two others, and saw the original art pieces, and then got a tour or sneak preview of the new murals in council chambers. And to say they are transformative, joy-making, heartwarming is an understatement. It's really going to be cool. I look forward to the day that we are back meeting in that room. And for the stress and struggles, it is truly a beautiful transformation in the room. So if we're looking a little glisteny, it's because of that. And see Mr. O'Connor has joined us.
Hi, Madam Chair.
Hi. So let's see. So we have basically one item on our agenda. We're getting an update on our unsheltered homeless and the work of St. Paul and Ramsey County. And we also have an kind of an update catch-all agenda item. And I, if you will, I would like to move the catch-all item first. So yield the floor to John McCarthy, our finance director, to just share a little information about CARES funding and amendments we will be seeing on our council agenda in the coming months so that we just have an understanding of how we are processing CARES funding. So it's not a mystery when these things come through our on our agenda. So I think it's helpful. We invited him to this meeting today as opposed to during our council meeting as we have the tax trends update from Chris Samuels at 3:30. So lots of items on the agenda. So we'll start today with Mr. McCarthy. And then after just a kind of a brief update on that, we'll switch to County Manager Ryan O'Connor and Deputy Mayor Jamie Tincher on the unsheltered homeless update. So welcome. Thank you for being here. And we'll turn things over to Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you. Good morning, council members. I'm going to try to share my screen here quickly. I've got a couple slides that I just wanted to run through really quickly on the CARES funding. Can folks see those? Is that up for everybody?
Yep.
Great. So as Council President Brenman referenced this afternoon at the council meeting, there's a resolution in front of you to accept St. Paul's share of the Coronavirus Relief Fund federal aid that was awarded through the CARES Act. This morning, I'll give you kind of a high-level overview of that funding and answer any questions that you might have. For some quick background, let's see, there we go. Is this... or to see which one is on the screen here, sorry. For some quick background, the state of Minnesota received over $2 billion of Coronavirus Relief Fund aid, or CRF aid, and Governor Walz distributed about $841 million of that aid to cities and counties and townships in July, which included about $23.5 million to St. Paul. Ramsey County received direct CRF federal funding in the amount of $96 million. And as I said, the resolution that's in front of you tonight would accept St. Paul's share of that funding. There are some kind of strict eligibility guidelines produced by the federal government that we need to follow on how we can spend these resources. To be eligible for CRF funding, expenses must be necessary due to the COVID public health emergency. They must be incurred between March 1st and November 15th. And they must have not been included in our most recently approved budget. St. Paul's timeline for this aid is different from the states and from Ramsey counties because they receive their funding directly from the Fed. So they both have until the end of December to spend their allocations. We have a very narrow window in which we need to fully use these resources to have them spent by mid-November. And the state guidance on this dictates that anything that we do not spend by mid-November would be sent to Regions Hospital. And just for your awareness, both the League of Minnesota Cities and Metro Cities, they're both advocating to have the deadline for cities extended beyond that November 15th timeline, just recognizing how challenging that will be for cities to get those dollars out the door by mid-November. Also important to note is that the CRF funding cannot be used as a revenue replacement. That's very clear in the federal guidelines. So, obviously, as everyone knows, we're facing pretty significant revenue shortfalls this year, but those dollars cannot be used to fill that revenue shortfall. In terms of reporting requirements, the city has to report to the state monthly. We have already submitted our July report just in the beginning of August. Since we hadn't officially accepted the funding yet through the council at the time of that report, the one that we submitted shows zero expenses. But part of the reason that we want to have the resolution adopted this afternoon is so that we can, by the time our August report is due, we will have been able to move over some eligible expenses into that grant budget. We know also that after the end of the grant period, we will be subject to both the state and federal audit on these expenditures. So we have been working kind of diligently since the very beginning of the COVID pandemic between OFS, HR, and emergency management to be tracking all of our pandemic-related costs. So we know we have good records for those future audits, and it's just a credit to those groups for our diligence early in this process that we sit well prepared for those audits that we now know we're going to have to go through. In terms of a review process for how we spend those dollars to track costs and eligibility, we put together a team with representatives from finance, from the city attorney's office, and emergency management, and that group is reviewing all proposals totaling about $45 million. We're reviewing those for eligibility, feasibility, and the benefit to the community and in our response. When we think about kind of the types of expenses that those could cover, it's things like providing economic assistance to businesses and families through the Bridge Fund. Public safety payroll costs are eligible. Payroll costs for staff that are performing substantially different duties than what we had envisioned that they would do this year. The key kind of obvious example there is that we've got librarians who've been making cloth masks for city employees, and clearly we did not build them into the budget at the beginning of this year to be making cloth masks. So that's an eligible expense. We also have other COVID leave and work comp related costs. As we, segue into the next presentation, we know we have substantial unsheltered response costs that are also eligible for reimbursement. To date, we have tracked over $16.5 million in COVID-related expenses through July, that is, and we know about $12.5 million of that is eligible for CRF reimbursement. So, as Council President Brennan touched on at the beginning, there's going to be an ongoing process through which we have to report our expenses to the state, to MMB, and we also will be coming back for future budget allocations, future budget actions to the City Council to allocate those resources to different expenditure line items. So again, the resolution in front of you tonight is very high level and is essentially accepting that $23.5 million funding so that we can start working on the costs that have already been spent and start allocating those resources to that federal aid budget, and then would be back for future council actions and informational sessions on how we're spending additional dollars. And with that, I'm happy to take any calls or any questions that you might have.
Okay, and I think it's, thank you very much. And this is helpful. And as you mentioned, we will see this CARES resolutions coming before us for the remainder of the year. And this is background really on all of them, and we'll get more detail on each of them as they come through our process. And I did note on the last slide, I think it's relevant that the Bridge Fund is refundable, or eligible rather.
Council President Brown, council members, that's correct. That the Bridge Fund expenses that we've already made are eligible, and any future similar assistance dollars would be eligible as well.
I think that's extremely noteworthy, and I wanted to make sure that got highlighted. I see Ms. Prince has a hand up.
Yeah, Mr. McCarthy, and the work that the committee is doing, you said there are $45 million in eligible expenses. Is that what I understand? So we should have no trouble being able to get our full 23.5 of the CARES Act money. Is that how I'm reading that?
Council President Bremmo and Councilmember Prince, we've had expenses that we've tracked through July that are eligible are about $12.5 million. We've had over $45 million worth of proposals that different departments and work groups have submitted for potential reimbursement. We're doing the process now of screening those for eligibility and feasibility. We know that some of them, I think to answer the gist of your question, clearly the need is there. We have more needs than this $23.5 million just to respond to COVID. Our biggest challenge is that November 15th timeline. We know it takes time to spend money in the city for lots of good reasons. And we know that some of these things take time to stand up. So again, that the League and Metro Cities are both advocating with our state partners for an extended timeline is really important to us to be able to make sure we get those dollars out the door.
And our bridge fund expenditures are being reimbursed, can be reimbursed. Is that right? So we potentially can restore the $1 million to the Housing Trust Fund and the $2.3 million to our business loan program.
Council President Brunmo and Councilmember Prince, that's correct.
Yeah. And then the other question I have about the bridge fund is, we know that we received many more applications than we were able to actually fund. So, and that it's my understanding that we did rank all of the applications. I mean, they were all put in that random order for awards, so that there is a potential there for us to continue to use the CARES Act money to fund additional businesses and families through the bridge fund. Is that something that's being considered?
Council President Brunmo and Councilmember Prince, I think that's absolutely something that's being considered, along with all of the other kind of high value needs that we have for that aid. But it's definitely something that we are considering, along with those other $45 million worth of potential costs.
Great. Thanks so much for all your hard work on this.
I'm sorry, Ms. Naker?
Thank you, John, for the presentation. Following up on Councilmember Prince's question, can you clarify, you might have said this and I missed it, but when this year we will know which expenses have been reimbursed by the CARES Act? Thinking about some of our business assistance funds, given that we had so much lower coming in sales tax revenue, we weren't able to make nearly as many Neighborhood Star, Cultural Star grants as normal. And so normally, I know we would use some of our business assistance funds to help those businesses, but we have depleted those to do the bridge fund. So I'm wondering if we will know at some point this year whether or not those dollars will be available and be able to use them to help some of our businesses.
Council President Brunmo and Councilmember Naker, I think are you asking when we will know when we have reimbursed the bridge fund expenses? Is that the question?
Right, and when we'll have confidence that we can then replenish our funds and use those dollars and get them out the door.
Sure. So I think there's kind of a first order of expenses that we have already incurred that we've been tracking closely since the beginning of March. I think the bridge fund falls into that category that we would like to kind of quickly move to move over to the federal funding budget, so that we then know what is available and what kind of the next tier of decisions are. So I think that would be our goal, would be to have the bridge fund reimbursement to be one of those first things that we move over to the grant, since it's already been spent and already tracked carefully. So ideally within the next once the resolution is passed, we'll have the budget set up, and so within the next few weeks, by the end of August, ideally we could move some of those existing expenses to the grant, including the bridge fund.
Great,
and then I'd have to work with PED and HRA to understand kind of what that means in terms of their ability to turn those reimbursed dollars around into a different program.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
And I'm really need to get us moving on to our first agenda item. So I'm going to just, I don't see people's hands up, but I'm just going to encourage people, as questions cross your mind, to follow up with Mr. McCarthy, also recognizing that this is the beginning of this process and we'll have ongoing opportunities to check in. But I got this update this late last week and thought it would be a good addition to this conversation today, just to kind of square us up on where we're at with CARES. So I'm going to move us on to our previous agenda item. I thank you so much, Mr. McCarthy, for being here today. And we will move on. So we are welcoming Deputy Mayor Jamie Tincher and County Manager Ryan O'Connor to talk with us a bit about our unsheltered homeless and the work that we're doing in concert to to meet the challenges that we are facing that are growing as we speak and due to COVID and other variables. I also see Mr. Cervantes, Director Cervantes is on the phone, and he may be presenting as well. But I think it is important that we check in. Commissioner Metis Castillo is also on the line, and she's headed up the Policy Advisory Group on Unsheltered Homeless as well. So we've got some good resources in the House, and I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Mayor Tincher, and you can sort things out on your end, how you'd like to present to us.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome.
I think Holly was going to help us with the presentation, so I'll lean on her for that. Council President Brunmo and council members, thank you for inviting us to present today. Commissioner Metis Castillo and County Manager O'Connor, thank you for the steadfast partnership in this space always. And to all of the incredible city employees who bring daily the dedication and the compassion to this particular work. Mayor Carter and I could not be more grateful or proud. The basic outline of the presentation, first we'll review the challenges that COVID-19 pandemic created for our residents experiencing homelessness. Then we'll go over the strategies that we pursued to try to address those initial needs. And finally, we'll provide specifics on the action plans that we're implementing now to try to meet the growing need in advance of the cold weather that's on its way. And I apologize, I'm going to read a lot of my points. This information is dense, it's complicated, and so I wanted to make sure that I was as concise as possible. So if we could go to slide 2, Holly. Before we dig in,
Ms. Tincher, to my colleagues, I would just say, usually we butt in and ask questions along the way. And I think in this case, if folks can hold off on their questions unless it's something where they need clarification on a particular topic, I think that would be great, just to make sure we get through the full presentation and then we can go back if that's all right with you.
Absolutely. So before we dig into the presentation that admittedly is going to be sobering, I included this in one other slide because I think it's important to remind all of ourselves that we've been doing a lot of work in partnership in this space since well before COVID hit. Together, we have the council, the mayor, the county, we've been clear for years that St. Paul is in a housing crisis and that crisis is particularly dire for our lowest income residents. If we go to slide 3, this council and Mayor Carter, along with our partners in Ramsey County and the St. Paul Public Schools, have been working to respond to the housing crisis with a variety of strategies and across the spectrum of needs, including prioritizing affordable housing investments in our economic development projects, creating the Housing Trust Fund, which was a $10 million upfront city investment with a $2 million annual ongoing contribution, starting and expanding the Safe Space Shelter, supporting the Familiar Faces pilot program, supporting and creating the Families First, a $300 monthly rent supplement and 3-year ongoing supportive services program for our families, supporting the Rush Outside In work, and so many other initiatives. We could go on and on. If we go to slide 4, had it not been for all of those efforts and all of these partnerships listed in this slide that we've built over the years, we would be in a much worse situation right now. And I will just say before we get into everything else, we will continue to work together and we're going to rise to this challenge and we're going to serve the people who need us right now. If we go to slide 5, as background, since 2018, the City of St. Paul has collected information on encampment locations in order to monitor the safety and health of occupants and to ensure that we're doing everything we can to connect them to services. And the guiding principles that we followed since that time is that everyone experiencing unsheltered homelessness is vulnerable and deserving of being treated with dignity and respect and in accordance with their rights. Every effort must be made to connect people to housing, shelter, and services, and that encampments represent a serious health and safety risk, particularly for those staying within the encampment, and do not represent a dignified form of shelter. This map shows a snapshot of the encampment locations in early 2020, just before COVID, the COVID outbreak hit. At that time, our standard operating procedures were that when an encampment location was reported to the city, our DSI staff would go to that location. They would conduct an initial wellness check. And then in partnership with our OTC staff, we would track the GIS location of that encampment, as well as information that didn't specifically identify occupants, such as the number of individuals, gender, if they were young, old. That information was helpful because then at regularly scheduled weekly meetings of our city staff, our nonprofit outreach partners, and others, the county, our homeless outreach teams, Met Transit, MnDOT, we would review each and every site through a spreadsheet together so that we could ensure that our outreach and supportive services were being connected to occupants sheltering outdoors that we were aware of, so that caseworkers could help connect them for housing and other resources and services. And according to our outreach partners, in 2019, there were 114 individuals who, through this partnership and this work that we were doing, they were able to help transition from the streets to indoor options. So again, in 2019, the reports that we have are there were 114 people that we were able to transition successfully. So prior to COVID, we also closed and cleared camps. On a site-by-site basis, the city would assess factors such as dangers posed by physical location, including weather conditions, environmental and health hazards, reports of violence, trafficking, or other criminal and antisocial behavior, size and duration, including buildup of trash and waste. Prior to clearing a site, the city would provide notice to outreach staff and to the occupants so that we could minimize loss of property and personal documents, which is really critical. We also would offer Ramsey County congregate shelter space options for occupants if we were going to clear a site. Another important effort that we did prior to COVID was in 2019, the City of St. Paul and Ramsey County executed a joint powers agreement, which started the process of allowing us to better coordinate and streamline all the federal grant resources that we receive in this space so that we could better serve the needs across the continuum. If we go to slide 6, we included this slide as just a refresher on the timeline following the emergence of COVID and the directives that were issued related to the encampments. So March 13th was when the state declared the peacetime emergency in response to COVID. The county and the city followed suit shortly thereafter. March 25th was when Governor Walz issued the stay-at-home orders. We'll talk a little bit more in how we were responding through COVID, but that was the stay-at-home order, which gave us some direction around how we were to move forward with the encampments. And then April 29th was when that guidance changed a little bit and gave us some flexibility. We all know that there were a number of other things, the murder of George Floyd, some other things that also happened in that preceding time. And so just as a reminder, that was the kind of the timeline that we went through. If we go to the next slide, I will turn it over to County Manager O'Connor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I hope that we're able to share a comprehensive set of information that really helps to level set the partnership, the challenges in front of us, and make no mistake. I mean, I don't think we're here to say we have it all figured out. I think we're here to say we're doing the best we can in an uncertain and ever-changing environment. If you were to ask me day to day, what are the issues that most concern me as we head into the winter and beyond this year? My phone is ringing, and I was like, whose phone is ringing right now? Sorry about that. I just broke my own rule for the first time this year. But if someone were to ask me, maybe that person was trying to do that, what is the most concerning issue in front of you as you go toward the end of the year and into next year? I just have to tell you, it's homelessness. it's housing instability, and all the ancillary issues that come with it. And we are not receiving the level of state and regional response or urgency to what is in front of us that we need. And for those of you who have been with the city for a while and worked with the county, there is a recurring theme that has occurred over many years where as it gets colder outside, people are almost surprised that it gets cold. And then we realize that there's this time when it's going to become untenable for people to be outside. And it's August 19th, and we all know it's going to get cold. And what you're going to see today is that we're doing our best, but we are not at a full solution for this winter yet. So to move back specifically into the work, as COVID-19 hit, it took an already challenging scenario and added to it. There were two immediate priorities in partnership with MDH guidance and with public health, working with the city and looking at our existing system of shelter providers that we immediately took on. The first was the need to decongregate existing shelters. Shelters as currently established do not allow for the appropriate spacing to allow for safe living quarters during a pandemic. And I think long-term, that's something we should continue to think and talk about in design and implementation of a shelter system and emergency housing solutions. But in the near term, that led to an immediate need to say, we just lost half our shelter space overnight. How do we bring that space back online so as to not further exacerbate what challenges sit in front of us? Alongside that was an immediate need to create what was first called isolation and quarantine space. It's now referred to as respite space for those experiencing COVID-like symptoms who are being asked to quarantine. This is not a place where you can require people to stay, so it needs to be a place where people are making a choice that this is where they are wanting to stay and be. And we had to figure out where these sites would exist. We have spent a lot of time looking for sites in the past, and so it wasn't like they were just ready-made places that also could deliver a medical model of respite on the fly. Ultimately, what we led to was a series of hotel contracts that I think many of you are aware of already, that at its peak has totaled between 300 and 400 beds at different times across a variety of different places to serve a significant number of guests that allowed us to depopulate shelters by 50%. We did hit that target as of a couple of months ago. We also had Mary Hall and formerly Boys Totem Town open up or reopen under new uses as a primary and secondary medical respite site during COVID. As the crisis has continued and the state has been unable to expand capacity to help us on the depopulation effort related to shelter or in the encampment space, we've had to pivot on the fly and move further down the list of potential options we had. We began to lose contracted hotel providers who either their contracts came to the end of their time and there was no interest in re-upping, or they exercised their contractual opt-outs. And as we lost hotels, we needed more space to simply keep the depopulation effort moving forward. So we have pivoted, and Mary Hall now has a census sitting around 90 to 100, depending upon the day, some dedicated to women, mostly general population that allows us to or just general emergency shelter use, I should say, that allows us to depopulate shelter and keep that work moving forward. That made Boys Totem Town become the primary respite site for Ramsey County. This is not ideal. That is not a site that we were looking to open for long-term living habitation again after closing it down last year. And that it is also a site where capacity will be stretched over the long term. We're currently using Kaler Hall at Boys Totem Town. Our census as of yesterday, I believe, was 1. It's been anywhere from about 8 to 0 at different moments. So we have not had a lot of individuals right now identifying with COVID symptoms. The concern we have is when flu season hits upon us and symptoms are hard to differentiate, that capacity could go very quickly. And I'm here just to announce that if it does go, we do not have a backup site anymore. We are using our backup site right now as general population depopulating of shelters. And so we sit on a tenuous precipice, knowing that right now we do have capacity in the respite space, and the depopulation piece has been undertaken. I will end this part by noting that hotel contracts are currently set to run till around the end of 2020. This effort, we'll talk more about funding levels later, but is all outside of any regular budgeted expenses and the many millions the county spends on homelessness. There is no clearly identified funding source nor strategy to maintain depopulation of shelter into next year. We are working diligently in the county on bridge solutions that will take us into 2021, but I want to put that in front of everyone as a clear and present challenge as we move into the end of the year. Jamie, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Holly, we could go to the next slide. The initial response from the city's perspective, the city's response to encampments has been evolving in alignment with Governor Walz's executive orders. So following the stay-at-home order 2020 and executive order 2033, the city temporarily halted the practice of closing encampment sites during the COVID pandemic. Following the governor's order issued in late April, which permitted local governments to close an encampment if it has well-documented threats to the health, safety, or security of residents, we'll continue to evaluate sites on a case-by-case basis. We're working to balance the basic human needs of those who have no alternative shelter available, contain the spread of the virus, and manage the various safety and security risks at encampment sites. And we'll talk about the area action plans that we're moving forward at this point in a little while. And to that end, we identified early on in response to the pandemic, a handful of encampment sites where we would provide sanitary services, so porta potties and portable hand washing stations. And that was to try to minimize the impact of the virus on encampment occupants, as well as help mitigate the spread through the broader unsheltered population and the general public. And I'll have a little bit of an update on how we're approaching that sanitary service component of this work in a little while. And then the next slide, I'll turn it back to Ryan.
This is working seamlessly. I think we got it down. In the ongoing challenges space and how COVID has exacerbated existing challenges, one of the best quotes I recently heard was, "A pandemic hits society as it is, not as you want it to be." And so in many ways, I'm well aware that you all talk about, know about, and are working on the topics that we discussed, but I do think it's important to restate some of them. You can see the list here, but it's not only a global health issue happening on our doorstep, it's also an economic crisis that we have not seen in almost a century. And when we know that at the peak, Ramsey County saw 28% of its workforce out of work, that was our Workforce Solutions number, and we remain north of 20 as far as I know right now. The concerning piece around the tenuousness between housing instability and economic instability and how these all intersect is significant. And that's why it's a real big challenge as we move forward, because someone who may be housed or finding stable housing tonight may find themselves facing an encampment or congregate shelter setting challenge in only a few weeks. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns in front of us. Obviously, you can see the piece around social distancing and the other idea that COVID has removed some of the traditional ways people have strung together solutions that are outside of traditional government responses, family and friends couches, for example, things like that. Day spaces and public spaces generally just aren't as accessible as before. And we do know that as we move forward into solutions too, low barrier shelter options have always been in short supply in this region as a whole. And we know that most of our challenge right now rests in the area of low barrier, culturally specific, smaller scale responses that are more tailored to those who right now look at current options and just say, this isn't for me. And so these are some of the many challenges associated with COVID, and I'm sure we could talk about them all day, but I will turn back to the Deputy Mayor to keep us moving.
The COVID-19 pandemic has caused an unprecedented rise in the number of homeless encampments and unsheltered individuals in the city of St. Paul. The week before last, there were 338 individuals sheltering outdoors. Last week, our numbers were 348. This week, our numbers are at 355 individuals who are now living in scattered encampments throughout the city. This is up from a high of less than 30 unsheltered residents reported at any one time in 2019. These are unsheltered homeless individuals living in tents, under bridges, in caves, or other places that are not intended as approved shelters within our city. In 2019, the highest weekly counts we had through our monitoring process that I described earlier was in October of 2019, and that was at 19 occupied sites and 26 individuals who were sheltering outdoors. At the end of March of this year, we had 20 occupied sites and 42 people sheltering outdoors. By the end of April, there were 68 occupied sites, and we went above 100 people sheltering outdoors. In mid-June, those numbers rose above 200 people sheltering outdoors, and in late July, the counts went above 300. And again, this week, our number is at 355 people who are sheltering outdoors in the city of St. Paul. A recent survey of approximately 90 of the individuals in the downtown area who are sheltering outdoors, which was conducted at the mayor's request, revealed that a majority of the folks that are outside reported that they are from the Twin Cities area. So that was about 64% of those surveyed reported that they are from our Twin Cities metro area. The majority, 71% of the individuals are male. And most self-identified as people of color at 62% of those surveyed. When I visited a number of the encampments a couple weeks ago, I talked with a pregnant woman who was living in a tent, and the outreach staff told me that they were aware of 3 pregnant women who were currently sheltering outdoors. I also talked with multiple women who showed clear signs of recent physical abuse. So there are a lot of challenges. There's a lot of basic human need and care that needs to happen in this space right now. But the numbers and the challenges that we are dealing with, we can see in the data and our process and our data collection that it is absolutely an impact of and in response to the housing crisis that was exacerbated by COVID. Ryan.
As we turn and look at, Holly, if you could advance to the next slide. On the resource side, I think there's always one of the biggest challenges as we work on issues related to homelessness, housing stability, and understanding the roles individual entities may play in the space and community partners is that this is one of the least defined areas in statute or in terms of any other directives in terms of what work sits where. And today what you're seeing is a partnership that we formed more on a basis of trust and commitment to a shared vision of a better future for more people across our community, in which the city plays a lead role in encampment management, the county leads in the shelter, permanent housing spaces. But I do want to be clear and say it's not as though it's that clearly defined everywhere in the state or even anywhere else. And that always leads to this question of what resources come to the table. Here's a list of the different resources that were easily identified for this conversation today, from the continuum of care, which is money that has existed well before COVID and now, and you can see then some of the other funding sources as well. One of the important things to highlight is to see those two CARES numbers next to each other. In this case, it totals $26 million in funding to leverage in terms of resources on the issues of housing instability along the entire continuum, in ways that alleviate pressure at all parts then of the continuum. I even think the 26 million number may end up being low. Ramsey County is actually using a range, and we wanted to be conservative here with you, but we may see a number as high as 25 million, depending upon how this year truly shapes up. And so just to give you a sense, and if you go back to Director McCarthy's presentation from only a few moments ago, he then shared the timelines we're under. And quite frankly, whether your timeline is November or December, when it comes to this work, I'm not sure there's a big difference there. It's enormously coming at us fast. And the significance of those timelines are real. And so we have a huge opportunity to be as creative as possible in how we're leveraging these resources right now. We also face a very significant cliff as we hit the end of 2020. And in all conversations that policymakers are having, I know Commissioner Modis Castillo and the leadership at the Policy Advisory Group and with the rest of the board, they're having as well is how do we continue to advocate for resources that will carry on beyond the end of the year, because CARES money is not the solution to that piece. We will use the CARES money now, but we're going to need different answers as we move beyond 2020. Jamie?
So our action plans and what we are doing right now to respond to the immediate needs of our unsheltered residents while strategically using those available COVID-related funds that have become available to address our longer-term unsheltered homelessness needs. We've developed in partnership 2 action plans. Action Plan 1 is designed to address longer-term and permanent options to serve individuals experiencing homelessness, and how can we leverage those resources that Ryan just went through in really smart and strategic ways that are going to serve us for the long term. Action Plan 2 is really about the immediate needs of individuals, the 355 people who have no housing as a result of the COVID pandemic, and what do we need to do as a city to best serve those basic needs. And so we'll go through each of these in more detail. So I'll kick it back to Ryan for Action Plan number 1.
Thank you. And these 2 plans are hand in glove partnership work happening together across both organizations. And I think it's one of the biggest things I'm challenged with is I often want to think about different areas of the housing continuum as distinct buckets to simply manage through the current conversation or to think about the challenges of the issues going on. But ultimately, we do know that if we create more permanent supportive housing options, that alleviates pressures on congregate shelter settings that some people are using as pseudo-permanent supportive housing options, which can then alleviate opportunities for people to have to stay on the street. And so there is this interrelated nature to the work where we need to be flexible and move to where the opportunities come as they become presented. We also then but we can't just sit back and wait for those opportunities to show up. We need to work together to also open doors as best as possible. As we move into Action Plan 1 and 2, the first goal is also to do no harm. So it's not to backslide on the work we've already established and walk through with you here today with the Deputy Mayor and myself over the last 6 months. We need to continue to hold the line on that work while moving into these 2 spaces. Our goal has been in a joint working group that involves city staff and county staff to identify approximately 100 beds of low barrier or no barrier shelter options that will enhance our ability as we move toward winter to respond to the challenges in front of us. That work's been underway for about a month in terms of all of the legwork and logistics around you need to be doing site evaluations. You need to be drilling into what needs to be done to make a site come online and be ready. We need to be thinking about the operational costs and sustainability of the model. And I don't even mean long-term sustainability. I mean from November until April in some ways right now. And then we'll figure out beyond April. And as a part of that, I just want to acknowledge 100 will in some ways probably feel paltry. It's built onto all the existing work already of the 400 spaces that have come online. The shelter system in the East Metro, the housing, the system that existed pre-COVID has been doubled since the beginning of COVID already. And so another 100 beds is not insignificant. But when we see the numbers in front of us, it does get to why, as the growth in encampments and tents has happened, 100 will matter, but it's not enough on its own. And we do need that state and regional partnership to come in and help us with everything else around that. We are currently looking at a variety of sites that I'm not able to share today, but I want to acknowledge there's been walkthroughs, dialogues happening. The city's been very involved. The county's been very involved. We're looking at the idea of, to Jamie's point about hearing about women outside who are particularly vulnerable. We know that women's shelter space has been one of the biggest areas that has been challenged during the pandemic. So how do we think about ensuring that is part of what comes back online as we move ahead? And so ultimately our goal is November 1st for this shelter space. It's an aggressive goal, but for all the reasons we've talked about today, it's a goal that we are going to push as hard as possible to meet. Jamie, you want to talk about Action Plan 2?
And before you move on to that, Ms. Tincher, I see Ms. Prince has been patiently Her arm must be sore. Her hand up, and I'll just. I think that was from right ahead of Action Plan 1. So, Ms. Prince.
Thank you, Council President Brendmoen, and thanks to Ryan and Jamie for this amazing effort. I just want to clarify. We're talking about people in encampments. So in terms of I know that the county and city are working together on youth and family homelessness efforts. And I just want to clarify if these action plans 1 and 2 include the work that we are doing with youth and homeless unaccompanied minors and youth and families.
Yes, and I think, Ryan, you could expand on this. I think that gets to what County Manager O'Connor was mentioning about we can't backtrack on the work that we have been doing. And so while they had a lot of challenges around the need to deconcentrate the amount of individuals that were in existing spaces that displaced individuals who we were already supporting. So if you think about the continuum of the housing supports that are provided, the 355 that I'm discussing are the individuals who, again, are in tents, caves, under bridges, but that is not the extent of the population that I think by various definitions would be included in a as homeless in the city of St. Paul. And so, Ryan, I'm not sure if you want to add to any of that.
Sure, and we can come back, council member, at the end if there's other questions or you want to drill deeper. And I appreciate the question because, again, it's important to note the distinctions between different populations and individuals and who's unsheltered and who's not is really an artificial distinction. Someone who stays in Mary Hall one night may be unsheltered a week later. We see and hear about this all the time. It's also why this is a very high-risk population for the spread of a virus because of the transient and mobile nature of individuals and the many interactions every day. On the family shelter side, since the beginning of COVID, we've expanded our capacity by more than 100%. I could go into the details on exactly how if you'd like to do that, but even that still leaves us with families that we're working with. There's about 40 families we're working with right now who would be defined as a wait list. A wait list is a tricky term. It's not that we're saying there's no option because we are trying to free up hotel spaces when needed. And we've had a policy to work to ensure people can get into a hotel. But being on a wait list is like not a good current situation, looking for more stable scenarios going forward. So, and then on the youth end, the youth is a challenging definitional part of this conversation. I think depending upon the conversation, I think youth has often been defined up to the age of 24. 18 to 24-year-olds have opportunities often to be a part of this conversation we're directly having because they can show up as individuals that'll show up in shelter, in congregate settings, and everything else. I think there is a distinction in how we need to think about under 18 versus over 18. And I don't want to get too far down that road because that's dangerous too. I'm not saying someone who's 19 years old is fully developed and all we should do is worry about shelter beds. I just say that because we've had a youth hotel program. We had limited success with it. There was a lot of, different types of feedback of which you're aware. But we continue, that continues to be one of the main focuses of our work, even if not the main focus of the presentation today.
Thank you for that clarification. And I do know that it is being addressed in other ways. And I do also want to say, it's the feedback that we're getting from those young adults that are 18 to 24 that they do not necessarily feel safe in adult shelters. So in any event, thanks for that clarification.
Yep. Holly, if we could go back to Action Plan 1, I'll touch on something else. And the other things that we are hearing that we need to really think and have an opportunity right now to create some solutions for, our trans community, our youth, our culturally specific populations. There are a lot of people who are very well served in those larger shelter spaces. And then there are folks that we are not well serving in those spaces. And so I know that the county is joining us in this moment to see this as an opportunity with the resources that we have to try to address some of those barriers. I'll just touch on some additional strategies that have come out of the work that our city team has come up with as a process of digging into this work. Freedom House, as you all know, with our BLS unit and the changes in that, we feel like that staff can be deployed into our fire stations. And so there may be an opportunity that we are aggressively working with the fire department and others to see if Freedom House could potentially become one of the solutions in this space to create more options for folks. The mobile assessment vehicle came from a conversation with Met Transit. They have a vehicle that they can do physical checks, wellness checks inside the vehicle, and they have access to the database and things for housing supports. We may have an opportunity now, and it may be a very good resource for us to have as the city of St. Paul in terms of the long-term, how we are serving individuals that are sheltering outside. And then, as you all know, tiny homes and other housing strategies and ideas, this is potentially the time to utilize resources and pursue some of those options that will give us some more longer term solutions in responding to the housing crisis that we're experiencing. So all of those types of things are things that we are trying to push toward the group that is working on that Action Plan 1. If we go to Action Plan 2, this is really the how are we going to rapidly mobilize resources to protect the immediate public health and public safety concerns that we have? The members of this work group with the City of St. Paul are meeting every day. They include Director Cervantes, Travis Bistadu, Stacy Murphy, Jeremy Ellison, Jesse Molnar, Jamie Sipes, Nicole Goodman, Director Hom, Erica Prosser, Lindsay Olson, Rachel Tierney, John McCarthy, Rick Shute, Matt Simpson. I mention all of that to just to make the point that many departments and many expertises are being brought to bear so that we can respond to the crisis that this is, and that the 355 people who are vulnerable and need our support right now, that we are bringing that as the city. Our strategies include developing coordinated area operational plans, which I'll review a couple of those in a moment. We're rapidly mobilizing resources to better meet the basic needs of occupants, such as meals, sanitary services, and first aid. Providing enhanced law enforcement and other services where needed to maintain peace and public safety. In the space of meals, currently there are about 200 meals that are being prepared by a nonprofit organization through grant funding right now. So that means if about 200 meals, which are, they're preparing a bagged lunch that has a sandwich, fruit, snacks. If there are 200 meals being prepared in that space that we are aware of, it means we have an unmet need of about 100 to 150 meals per day. So Ramsey County Sheriff's homeless outreach team are delivering about 150 meals to the largest encampments. And then our outreach partners from Radius and People's Inc. deliver about 25 meals to each of the various encampments as they are doing their work. And we know that additional nonprofits and volunteers are delivering meals to various locations in the city. Our goal is, with the support of the city's Emergency Operations Center staff, we need to create a coordinated, synchronized effort so that we can ensure that the residents that are sheltering outdoors as a result of COVID have access to food. Our team is working now with the following goals. We are planning to increase that nonprofit meal production to 300 to 500 meals per day. We are going to coordinate preparation and delivery so that we can achieve, so we can ensure that the 350 individuals, 55 individuals who are outdoors are getting those meals every day. Moving forward, we would like to deliver a hot meal per day at the largest safe encampments. And the strategic piece of this is that if we can synchronize the meal and essential service delivery, so like first aid, mental and chemical health assessments, that outreach support, we feel like that synchronization of the meal delivery, one, is serving those basic needs that we have some moral obligations to do, but it's a mechanism that may help us connect individuals to those other options that we're trying to bring online through Action Plan 1. If we go to the next slide, the sanitary services. So the city, we recognize that there may be some value in coordinating, consolidating the encampment sites in order to help focus those available resources to the greatest number of unsheltered individuals during this unique time. So the purple stars on the map in this slide indicate the locations that we've placed portable bathrooms and/or hand washing stations. There are 3 key guidelines that our work group has developed to explain our rationale as to where and how sanitary services will be supported in the city of St. Paul. Number 1, the city intends to only support sanitary services at city-owned properties. Number 2, the services will not be provided at encampments, regardless of the size of the encampment, if the location is inherently dangerous to the occupants of the encampment or to others who may be in the same space. And number 3, this effort is intended to be iterative, and some sites may be closed should unanticipated consequences arise. If we go to slide 16, we get into what our work group has been doing through our daily conversations. We needed, because we have locations across the city and there are unique dynamics within each of those locations, our approach at this point is to have area operational plans that are unique to those circumstances in those locations. And so one of those area operational plans is the encampments near 35E and Kellogg Boulevard. As referenced previously, Governor Walz's executive orders 2047 and 2055 specifically authorize local jurisdictions to clear encampments if they possess documented threats to the safety of occupants. That grassy area along I-35E is owned by the state of Minnesota. And prior to COVID, it was designated as a location that the city of St. Paul did not allow tents to locate. For the reasons laid out on this slide, we believe that the encampments at this location need to be cleared, and we'll work with outreach service providers in Ramsey County to plan for the assistance that will be needed for the current unsheltered residents in that area before commencing clearing activities. If we go to the next slide, another area operational plan that we're focused on is the Lower Town area, which is inclusive of Mears Park, the Tot Lot, the Union Depot Station. We know that this crisis has created safety and livability issues for those operating downtown businesses and many who reside downtown. Our team's goal is to restore a sense of safety and security for the residents, businesses, and visitors in the Lower Town area. The St. Paul police officers who are assigned to this area, they are focused on protecting the peace and maintaining public safety while clearly minimizing the negative impacts and preserving the dignity of individuals experiencing homelessness. And we say in our work group calls often, we are not going to criminalize homelessness. Since July 14th, 2020, the St. Paul Police Department has conducted 3 large-scale enforcement operations at Mears Park. What we know is that where we have unsheltered individuals and vulnerable populations, that attracts predators and others who come into that space, not because they are homeless, but because they are preying on individuals who are vulnerable. So that the July 14th operation resulted in over 20 arrests and caused a disruption to the criminal activity and disorder that was happening in that area. SPPD and community members have noticed that when officers are present in the park, there are less issues and complaints, and those efforts have also helped restore a sense of safety and security to community members, including the individuals experiencing homelessness or unsheltered living conditions. On July 23rd, SPPD began to dedicate 2 officers to proactively patrol and provide a police presence in Mears Park 24 hours a day. While this effort has been resource intensive, it has proven to be extremely effective in achieving our goals. We've seen a dramatic decrease in dramatic difference in the park itself. However, we noticed that the problems and the criminal activity have shifted south along Sibley Street between 4th and 5th Street. So, we're just going to continue to make adjustments to the strategy so that we can continue to figure out how to maintain that safety and livability. In order to staff this properly, SPPD has reallocated patrol officers from other areas of the city. They've incurred overtime expenses, and we believe that those are CARES reimbursable. If we go to the final slide, I'm sure there are questions. We recognize that the steps we're taking in Action Plan 2 is addressing only the symptoms of the problem. We know that the underlying root causes are much more complex and will require successfully implementing the strategies in Action Plan 1. We're focusing our energy and our resources that have been made available to respond to COVID on long-term sustainable strategies that include but are not limited to ways that we can better support individuals in our community who need help to heal from trauma, treatment for chemical dependency, care for mental health, and access to housing. With that, we're available for questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I see Ms. Naker.
Thanks so much, Council President, and thank you, Deputy Mayor and Ryan, for being here and presenting. I think I've held all my questions, and I think at this point I have 3 of them. I boiled it down to that. So first of all, I appreciate the immense amount of work you're doing, and speaking for Ward 2, I really appreciate the extra dedication of law enforcement officers downtown. It has made a huge difference, and I know that it is a resource drain on other parts of the city. So I'm grateful, and I know my constituents are grateful. My questions are, first of all, you mentioned needing help from the state and from the region, and I'm wondering what the concrete plan is and how we can help in bringing the state on board, not just for funding, but in the regional collaboration that we've talked about, that we've been at the table at for so long, because I appreciated the message that the folks who are here are from the Twin Cities Metro, but the Twin Cities Metro is a big place. And we are doing everything we can, but we as a city cannot do this alone. And hearing just the list of people who are on Action Team 2, that's the director of every department in our city. So we are literally taking all of that staff time and capacity and dedicating it to one huge issue, but just one issue, while there's lots of other work to do. So I guess I'm wondering what we can do to help with that demand and plea for more help at the regional level and the state level. My second question is about longer term housing. I know we have needed more shelter space for a long time. We haven't increased the number of shelter beds, I would say, proportionately to the need for a long time. But we also, it seems like we need something between shelter and housing, because despite our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we can't build new housing units quickly enough to meet the need. And shelter is supposed to be short term to allow people to move out and move to somewhere else where they can live on a more permanent basis before maybe an apartment is built. So I guess I'm wondering, to the point of the tiny houses and maybe single room occupancy buildings, is there conversation about something that's an in-between state? And then finally, I think the biggest concern I hear from my constituents is just not knowing what our plan is and what our strategy is. Hearing from you today is so helpful. I want to make sure people know that we are aware of this, that we're on it, that so many smart people are doing work on this. So how are we communicating this to the public beyond just today's presentation on a more ongoing basis?
Great. So I think to the first, and it starts to go into the second, and Ryan, you should jump in on this as well.
Yep.
The state did allocate $100 million toward housing supports. Ryan, I think that you and the county are more briefed on that than I am. I know that our housing staff in PED would be tapped into sort of what are the strategies around those housing pieces. But to your question around how do we tap these other resources, I think that's why it's really important that, one of the slides that we included was a listing of here's all the funding that is available. And you look at those dollars and it's massive. I mean, it's millions of dollars that we're trying to put into this space to serve the need. And it is so complex and complicated, and there's so many subpopulations, and the needs, the sort of niche needs in terms of how are we going to meet this individual where they are. I've said on our work groups, one of the things that we've sort of started saying is this week we need 348 solutions. Next week we're going to need 355. Like this week we need 355 solutions. So I think it is a question about how much money, how many resources can we put in. But another thing that we've seen that we think is going to be really helpful is that strategic coordination and alignment of all the services, so that we are maximizing those touch points to those 355 individuals is going to be really critical. And so, Ryan, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that space. I think number one and number two kind of go together.
Yeah, and I'll take them a little bit in reverse order. I think I'll just say on the third question about sharing the information, the other thing I just want to add is, and it takes almost every hour of every day to stand up and sustain this effort. And so the policy action group that has been created, of which the council is a party, and as elected officials, I mean, one of the most important spots where the partnership matters across staff and electeds right now is both on the advocacy side of resources, but also on being this communication side and, making sure we arm everyone with that information. We need help communicating it, because every hour I spend communicating, I can't work with staff across this organization to implement the plan. And I don't mean to set it up as though it's an either or choice all the time, but it is one of those spots where I think we need to keep having that part. And Commissioner Matas Castillo is on here today in part because bringing this presentation to the Policy Advisory Group Subcommittee was something that we have talked about a little. And I think there's more opportunity of how do we keep sharing it in broad ways that way. And until today, we haven't had this comprehensive of a deck. So I want to acknowledge that that's also a step forward. On the part about in between options, yes, it's every type of option is a good option approach as long as it's dignified and it helps people move out of circumstances that are not okay. I had some people who have been at this far longer than me spend time walking me through federal level investment in housing options since 1960 to today and saying, this is not magical. Like, do not overthink this problem and where it sits. And I appreciated people taking the time to walk me through that and realize that we just do not invest as a society in ensuring that people stay out of poverty the way we used to. And I think it is as simple as we need more options all the way along the continuum and should not apologize for that advocacy. On the final piece on number one, I'm going to start with a little bit of a story because I think it's important. And I want to acknowledge it is not a level of intent or care from many of our state leaders and even regional partners. Sometimes I want to acknowledge people care. I also want to say alongside that, they are not doing enough. And I don't mean that as a critical thing in a mean way. I just mean it as look at the current numbers and look at the growth happening. We all have to continue to lean in new ways. Salt Lake City, a few years ago, hosted a national counties event for large counties. And one of their days was focused on homelessness. If you went back and looked 7 years ago, Salt Lake City declared that they had ended homelessness. And it was a huge national story. And we were sitting downtown looking at a homeless site that now was a housing site that had been fenced off where you needed an ID badge to be able to be there. It was state-controlled land in their downtown Salt Lake City with 1,000 individuals, adults, children, families, men, women. There was no distinction. And it was super ugly and really scary. And it was a mix of drug use and an issue that had found its way to Salt Lake, mixing with housing instability. And when they talked with us that day, they said, the biggest thing that happened is we fell asleep at the switch. We didn't take it seriously enough. We thought we were doing okay. And then one day you wake up and the problems have gotten so significant, it's out of control. And it started then with massive law enforcement intervention being part of the solution. I'm not saying that's where we are right now, but you can see our trend lines moving in a scary direction in a way that doesn't serve people well on the ground, and it ultimately fractures communities. I think right now, state investment matters, but we need a serious conversation with leadership coming from other levels that recognizes there are 1,000 people across the 2 core cities who do not have a place to rest their head under a roof every night right now. And at some level, like, we can talk it to death all day long, but like, we need 1,000 solutions, as the deputy mayor just said, by November 1st. We're going to bring 10% of that to the table right now through what we just laid out. We're going to keep trying to figure out the rest. I need someone else to just raise a hand and say, we got 500 of these, and I don't have a perfect answer for how to do that, but I'm at the point where I just need to say they need to help us somehow figure that out.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And recognizing these are hard questions and complicated answers. And I do want to underscore the comments just about upstream investment versus the amount of resources and money it takes to deal with these things on the back end. And, when we talk about some of the pilot programs that we've done and some of the investments we're doing on the front end, the price tag is a fraction of what we're talking about to deal with these issues on the backside. So I know that we know that, but I feel like it's worth mentioning again. I see Ms. Jalali has a hand up.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone here for this very exhaustive presentation and setting some context, and for your candor and urgency. I think that is just where people are at in their hearts and in their gut when we just live in our community and go around and exist and see things, and it's hurtful. There's a trauma and kind of a community experience of it that is starting with the people who are actually vulnerable and at risk of assault and also need a place to live. And then there's folks who want to help but feel like their efforts are outmatched by the weight of it. And then there's everybody kind of onlooking who then sees things at the final stages that are also very painful, which is clearing encampments and seeing those confrontations escalate. I understand when resident groups like literally form hands around groups of tents and want to stop what are ultimately evictions, even if the situation has become very untenable, because our community cares very deeply about what happens to our most marginalized. And I have a question around, because I think we all want to break out of this cycle and not have these compounded traumas anymore and see people be housed. What are your thoughts, each of you or as a group, and where the conversation is on finding shelter space out of existing space where we have buildings and spaces around the community that are privately managed or owned or in some way are just not serving a purpose? But then is it actually potentially more cost efficient to create shelter space? And I appreciate Commissioner Manis-Castillo being on this call, because she and I worked on figuring out how to convert the Bandana Square location old hospital into a family shelter space, or space that's being used right now to expand capacity for COVID. And Trista's just the kind of person who sees an old building with nothing going on and like figures out that it's actually shelter potential. And then we worked with Director Cervantes and DSI, and it was just a city-county collaboration. And I think there are so many spaces like that if we could somehow figure out how to tap. There's so much community appetite, I think, for just being a part of it. I know that it gets really hard and complicated when it's like a risk, and politically and financially people have to be on the hook at some point. But what's the work to like expand capacity, not through waiting for money to fall from the sky for like very costly shelter construction, but figuring out how to use a little of what we already have and staff those places so they're safe. And there's so many pieces that you can't just put a bunch of people in a building and say, all right, well, now you have a home, because that's actually like harmful too if you're not thinking it through. But that's an area of the work that I've been thinking about a lot and that constituents bring up to me a lot. So I hope this question makes sense, but like, how can we grow that area and meet needs? Do you see a potential for that?
Council President, Councilmember Jalali, Jamie, I'll take the first shot because it ties a little bit to Action Plan 1 that we talked about earlier. Without getting into specific sites that I mentioned earlier, because it's really a point of like process legally where I can't do that publicly. the types of sites you mentioned are what we're looking at right now for this November 1st expansion of up to 100 places. We're not trying to build new. We're trying to retrofit existing in humane ways that would work well across the community. So it is logical to think that sites like the one you just mentioned and some others are the types of places that we are spending time kicking the tires on to say, what are the opportunities? And quite frankly, if we find 200 good sites, then we're going to want to look at that. We're not like constraining ourselves to 100. The only thing I'll say on the cost side, and I don't mean to be a downer on this at all, and I don't want to use cost as an excuse not to see effort. I mean, I think that's really dangerous too. I want to underscore the operational needs and the challenges long term. So if we were to open up, like Ramsey County's expanded by a little less than 100 shelter assistants since the beginning of the pandemic. And that's a pretty significant creation of a department in short order. And when you start to do the costs with that on year over year, at a year when we're doing having to evaluate the county board's budget, next week they're going to get a presentation on an amended budget. It's like we're building a new department while also having to make real tough choices on the fly in a lot of other spots. And the dollar amounts get into the millions pretty quickly. And so there is this part of long term. How do we continue that conversation of sustainable ongoing funding sources beyond asking the communities most impacted through property taxes to foot the entire bill? Because ultimately every community around us benefits from the conversation we're having today too.
Mm-hmm.
And Ryan, I would just add to that there's the real estate piece and that cost, but then there is the immense amount of work and ongoing cost for staffing those operations and staffing with the expertise and the skill sets that are going to be required there. We have individuals who we need to make sure that we are meeting those needs for trauma support and chemical dependency, mental health supports. And I know that our incredible park staff during COVID stepped in and provided a lot of that support to some of the county operations. But that those operational costs are the long-term real planning that we need to be really thoughtful about.
Thank you.
I see Ms. Prince.
Thank you, Council President Brenmon. One thought, I guess I realize in the list of funding that it did include CDBG and the ESG money, and that does come from the feds. But, obviously if with any luck, maybe we'll end up with a federal government in the foreseeable future that will get back into funding the housing needs of our country, because it has been 40 years of disinvestment by the federal government that really put us in this problem. And I know I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't realize already, but I'm hoping that there might be a glimmer of hope on the horizon that we'll start seeing some additional federal investment. So that's just a comment. But in terms of questions, and I don't expect you to go into any detail about it, but if you would just be willing to touch on the effort that we are doing with youth and family. I recognize that there was a sense that the hotel program did not go very well that was done for youth, but I believe that there has been some additional discussion and coordination between the youth, the organizations that serve youth, in working with us to do a better job on our response to the youth and family crisis. So if you could just touch on what's happening, because I know that people are tuning in this morning who just want to hear that we are equally committed to that part of the homeless issue.
Thank you, Council Member. Madam Chair, to your first comment too, I feel like I've been a downer on some of this. So let me give you a moment of optimism and appreciation back toward the city and the work happening from the council and throughout leadership across the city. I've been with Ramsey County since 2013. I had never worked on issues related to homelessness until I came to the county, and you can't work here and not be involved in them. Very quickly, you find that out. So I've worked on this topic now for the last 7 years here. I shudder to think at what a 2014 Ramsey County St. Paul response right now in the moment would look like here. And that's a credit to a lot of leaders that are on this conversation today. From the deputy mayor's presentation and the leadership from the mayor to the city council and their willingness to partner with the county board, and Commissioner Modest Castillo chairing the policy advisory group and a focus on this topic. And I do want to pause and say thank you for that, and recognize that we should. It's not worth, like, you can't celebrate too much when you have the challenge in front of us that we have, but I do need us to recognize that progress gets made day over day, and there's so many staff and leaders that are a part of that. Specifically to your question, council member, so there has been a youth hotel program. I don't want to define it as successful or not. I don't want to make it a binary thing. I think it's always learning as we go and seeing how people vote with their feet, right? Like, do they show up? And what we've seen is the observed number of youth that we think may exist in the community needing supports, and the number that we are able to get into programs, there's a big mismatch that we continue to see there, which is a sign that we're not doing something right. And so simply reinvesting in that model won't necessarily get us there. It doesn't mean the model is bad. It just means we're kind of missing. And that's like constant evaluation in many ways. We have been supporting the program, or we ended this youth hotel program we started with. We're currently conducting a survey and an assessment and evaluation with young adults to determine long-term housing stability needs. And our Financial Assistance Services Department has a youth ambassador program working with wraparound services and housing stability. We're trying to go directly to the young people who have said they have needs that you referenced earlier and asking them, like, why hasn't this worked so far then? Because somehow we're missing the mark. And I have very young children. I'm sure everyone on here has different ages of children, or aunties and uncles in different ways. How often are you the old person who thinks you know what a young person wants, only to find out you're woefully out of step? And I think this is one of those spots where we have to keep going back and having those dialogues. On the family shelter side, the Family Service Center serves 65 individuals. That's the size of what we've had traditionally. Since the beginning of COVID, Project Home Interfaith now has up to 75 individuals being served, which is a pretty significant expansion. And then another 11 are in the emergency hotel program that's been written about some as well. And so we've seen an expansion there. But like I mentioned, we still have 41 that we're working with, individuals we're working with, who would kind of be on that wait list in the middle piece. And so we're not there either. And I don't want to come away saying we got this all solved today. I just want to acknowledge we're trying to figure out where to go. And I just don't think there's one easy answer to where we go next.
Right. And I do appreciate that. One thing I wanted to mention is in some of the work that I've done with the youth groups that work with homeless youth, it's a definitional problem on their side. Apparently, young people who are homeless don't necessarily define themselves as that. They don't see themselves as that. And I recently talked to a neighbor of mine who did a graduate study on this issue about 10 years ago. It was fascinating to me. And what she discovered in talking to seniors in high school was that across the board and without regard to income level, school success, whatever, that 10% of high school seniors in her study did not have a home that they counted on. I mean, they didn't have what we would consider permanent housing because they just moved around. So, I mean, I think this is something that it's a problem that youth may not recognize, but now that because of COVID, because of, as you said, that couch hopping isn't the option that it was, it is really problematic. My final question is just that we all know that the eviction moratorium is something that is going to affect these numbers, I'm assuming. And so I'm sure we all share the goal of trying to maintain that moratorium into the winter months, but I wondered if you could comment on that.
Councilmember Prince, or Council President Burnmoen, Councilmember Prince, I think that the eviction moratorium, everything that I have heard, the state, the governor intends to continue that. I think that it follows his executive orders, so it's a month to month that they're doing that. I think that, as well as, what we saw with the unemployment assistance, and to Council President Burnmoen's comment earlier, the unemployment insurance, the $600 benefit on the front end, that's a lot cheaper than if those individuals who are being supported by that fall into homelessness. And so I think efforts like the eviction moratorium, the supports that we're doing along the housing continuum to provide some stability through the pandemic, those are equally important to the investments that we're making to deal with the increase in unsheltered and other things. So I think it's just striking that balance across all of those supports, that we just have to do all of it.
Thank you for that, Deputy Mayor. And I just want to say in closing for my part, I've been around the city probably longer than most of the people on this call, just simply because of age and career choices. But I just want to say this partnership between the city and the county, that is such a close partnership between the county manager and the deputy mayor, is really unprecedented. And I am so deeply grateful, as I'm sure my colleagues are, that we are dealing with this problem at the highest level of our municipal governments. And I'm just really grateful for everything you're doing. And I truly congratulate you on the extent and the breadth and depth of this effort. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Prince. Can you just imagine if we were stepping on top of each other and not working in concert? It's incredibly important that we're doing this in partnership. I'm looking at my colleagues to see if folks have any additional comments at this time. I will say that I don't think this is a one and done conversation, obviously. We certainly would benefit from continuing to check in like this on a regular basis as we go through our budget season and into the cold winter. And so I do appreciate the update. Ms. Mattis Castillo and I both serve on the Policy Advisory Group. I thank you, Ms. Mattis Castillo, for your leadership in getting that group together to advise and work on these issues, and have been trying to share updates from that group to the full council. So we've been somewhat updated, but I think hearing this directly from Deputy Mayor and the County Manager has been incredibly helpful and informative for us today. I do not see other folks with their hands up. So if you have closing comments, Trista, you've got a nice smile on your face. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just want to really thank you all for this work and collaboration. I'll say the one request I have is, I know we are all receiving a lot of calls and emails from constituents concerned about what they're seeing in their community. And so if collectively we can share that, yes, we have people who are living outside. We don't want them outside either, that we are working really hard, and that we ask for their patience and cooperation and collaboration, and to really give people the space and dignity. I know it's uncomfortable when we take a walk in a park and we see folks who are homeless living, and it feels unsafe for lots of folks, but we're working on it as fast as we possibly can and to address it as we can. And so if you could just reassure constituents that we are aware these folks are getting resources, as you heard today, they're getting checked up on. We're doing the best we can as fast as we can. And so to continue to share that would be really helpful.
Madam Chair, just before I jump off, 3 real quick final pieces. Commissioner Mattis Castillo didn't say this, but I think it's a good one to always add. She continues to reflect back whenever we meet on the idea that if this was a natural disaster and we saw 1,000 people outside without a place to sleep, think of the response that would occur. And I think of Iowa this week and what we're seeing in terms of the devastation and how scary that is. And yet, because this is more slow moving, we struggle to somehow organize and respond similarly here. And that ties into the second part, which is I really do appreciate the willingness of the state to want to talk throughout this. And I think that's important that they haven't turned a deaf ear or a blind eye to the work. But the action steps remain still the 1,000 people and the natural disaster reference. And any work that the council can do with the board to continue to figure out ways to broaden that conversation and say, we just can't, like, it's not, we don't want to sit here and scream, but we need to see stuff happen. We need help. Anything will be helpful. Finally, to the presentation and sharing it, Jamie and I, when we planned yesterday, we ended by saying, this might be good to go to the policy advisory group at some point and have there. And so I'll leave that for consideration for others, but just wanted to flag that hopefully today's not the only run of the PowerPoint, because there was a lot that I think it was good to put in one spot. Thank you all for the time today. I appreciate being here.
Wonderful.
I would just dovetail with that. I think we need to continue the conversation. What I think has been challenging in this space is putting the pieces together. You know, there was so much of a waiting game around what resources are going to be available. How can we have the tools that we need to respond? And I feel like, you know, we have zeroed in on what are the actions that we're going to take? What are the next steps? And we've structured it now in a way that I think policymakers can come in and help us advance concepts like tiny homes and other options for housing. You know, how do we have that policy conversation and advance that while we have staff that are dedicated to coordinating and synchronizing those basic needs services. And in this space, there's going to be a need for, you know, how do we invite our whole St. Paul community to help us and support the individuals that we need to support in a way that is supporting the outcomes that we're trying to see. So we needed that space where our emergency operations staff can work with partners and design a process where if we have 355 meals that need to get distributed to 355 people today, how do we do that and how do we do it and transparently communicate how if you want to bring some resources to that effort, here's where you come. Here's how you do it, and it's not at cross purposes with, you know, our need to keep spaces clean, garbage free, things like that. So, so it's absolutely the first step in many other conversations, and I think we're now ready to be able to accept a lot of that help and support in a strategic way.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Obviously, it's been well received and very helpful for all of us. So thank you. And again, we will continue to have this conversation as the weather changes and the need becomes more urgent. And we really appreciate your work so very much. So thank you. To my colleagues, that brings us to the end of our agenda. I hope you've been noticing throughout the meeting that there's been interviews going on in the council chambers at the new murals. Woohoo! And hopefully folks haven't had a chance yet to buzz through there. It's spectacular. We meet again today, so we will reconvene later, but for now we are adjourned.